Hello, listening people.
Hello.
Hello, Bartek. How are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad, Ryan. How are you doing, Ryan?
I am doing fantastic. I've gone on quite the wild ride with the movie we will be discussing today, and it's got me very excited to be chatting with everyone, including you, yet again. How are you doing, though, Bartek? You're still recovering?
Yeah, pretty much better for people that, for listening people that don't know. We did the last episode remotely because I caught the COVID. 5 years in, I managed to avoid it, and then it just came to me. I wasn't even going to work or anything, but somehow it caught me. Not that I caught it, it caught me. And we're doing this one again remotely just to be safe, but I'm pretty much better.
Pretty much better, and I'm glad to hear that you're on the mend, and we're going to make sure that you keep on the mend by doing our podcast, which brings everyone into high spirits, not just us two, but you, the listening people out there. I know it perks you up each week. We come in, Bartek and I, to present to you some interesting Polish facts. Bartek, any this time?
Nope.
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 Not one?
I guess
not a single one.
I guess Poland should just be more interesting more often.
Any non-interesting facts?
It's next to Germany.
How close?
How close?
Yeah.
It's in what way?
You decide what way.
I mean, I think
spiritually, how close is it?
Probably pretty spiritually close. Geographically, I mean, I'm sure the border is like a millimeter long, right?
In comparison to sea level, how close? There you go.
That's a good question. What's the closest sea country? Would it be like Denmark or something?
Okay.
That's right above Germany.
There's no seas in Poland.
No, I think it's landlocked. I think the fact about
Unsure?
Poland is that like every single country around it has tried to invade it at some point, except like Czech.
Thank you, Czech. You silly versions of the Polish, you. We are here to do Pictures Powwow, where we sit down and have a conversation about a movie that has come recommended. Each week, it is a film that has been selected by a particular person. We have a cycle. The first time round, it is Bartek. Then the second week, it is me. And the third, it is you, the listening people. And it has fallen upon my film selection this time. And we are talking about the 2006 film Memories of Matsuko, which is a Japanese movie. And it is a return for a director that we have covered before, but this is a film that actually came out a few years earlier than the previous one that we have discussed on here. So the film that we discussed previously, that was actually a recommendation from Bartek, or when did we do it was Confessions, was the movie that this director did, but when did we do it?
We did it for a spooky month a few years ago, and if I'm not mistaken, we were doing that during COVID lockdowns, and for our 100 episode milestones, we like to do a special episode. That episode actually fell on a 100 episode milestone. I think it was technically our 300th episode. And we were saying during it that, this is the 300th episode, but this isn't the celebratory one. So, yeah, a little over 100 episodes ago.
Wow, what a time. And the director is, what's their name again? Tetsuya
Nakashima, I think?
Yes.
There we go, we said it.
And I picked this because I have not seen any other film than Confessions, and one of the trivia points that is brought up with Confessions was it was his first non-comedy film, so I wanted to see his previous work to see what his comedy films were like. So I picked the last comedy film he did, because in between Memories of Matsuko and this, he did a children's movie, or a family film, so maybe we should check that out just for the sake of it.
Wait, sorry, between Memories of Matsuko and this?
Yes, there's another film in between that he did that's more of like a family movie, like a family magical movie. If you even look at his IMDb or Wikipedia, it has like a goofy poster. It's like Paco and the Magical Book. So he worked on that as
Oh,
director.
between
So
between Matsuko and Confessions, I see.
yes. So we are here today to talk about memories of Matsuko. Bartek, how about you give people the rundown of this film? Entice them.
Sure, this is a bit of an epic tragicomedy musical film. Japanese title is Kiraware Matsuko no Isho, Life of Despised Matsuko, it says here. And it is telling a posthumous story about a young man living in Tokyo on his own, whose father comes to him and says, "Hey, uh, my older sister, your aunt that I never told you about, has passed away. I've got her ashes right here in front of me. I need to go back home for work. I need you to go to her apartment and clean up because it's a bit of a pigsty." Um, and he goes there and he starts learning bits and pieces about who this Matsuko aunt woman was. And the majority of the film is us seeing Matsuko's story play out, again, posthumously, and just learning about her, hopes and dreams and the brutal reality that she went through. And it is an emotional roller coaster.
It's also a mystery because she was murdered. That's
Yeah.
something to note. We get told up front she was murdered. So there's an element of like who killed her to this and how did she meet this fate as well. But it is a very intense movie, which is not a surprise, honestly. I've mentioned it, but Confessions, which came out in 2010, 2011, so a few years later, is a very intense movie itself. Highly recommend it. It's a very good movie, but this director slash writer, he has a very specific way of going about telling stories, and he has, well, out of the two we've seen, some recurring things that he's fascinated and interested by. And the way he shows them is very, very upfront and very confronting, and you go through a lot of emotions while watching this. Now, neither of us had seen this before. I didn't know anything about it other than I looked at the IMDb and I went, okay, this is his previous, like, in quotations, last comedy film that he did before his new era, where after Confessions, it seems like he's really leaned into fucked up non-linear films, which, hey, I'll watch some of those too. They seem good. But I didn't know anything other than that. I didn't know the premise. I knew the title. I saw the poster, but that doesn't really give you too much to go on. So I didn't know what actors would appear. I didn't know the length of it. I didn't know if it was a period piece or what. It could be anything. I didn't even think about how much of the filmmaking style would be the same or not. I made a joke last episode that I assume there will be silly sound effects because it just feels like it's his thing. Spoiler alert, there are silly sound effects in here. And I, of course, raised it was a musical because that came up in its genre of like musical. So I was also knew that. But truly, blind to this experience, and I will say to everyone now, go into this movie like that. It's good to know that it's a bit of an intense experience, but it's a rewarding movie nonetheless. I don't think this film is cruel for the sake of being cruel. I think it has more of a hopefulness to it than you may expect it to. And if you have seen his other movies, I would love to hear people's opinions on them as well. But definitely give this a watch. That's my way of just letting everyone know we're going to start digging into the film a lot more. Bartek, tell us your experiences with Memories of Matsuko.
So, like you said, yeah, I walked into this one blind, hadn't heard of it. Even Confessions, that was just me looking for, oh, what's like a spooky Japanese film that I could find? Because we hadn't really done any of those, and we just happened to come across a bit of a gold mine. But yeah, this one I basically only saw the poster, and based on that alone, I assumed that it would be uh, a period piece of some sort, not like, super far back, but like more recent 20th century, just based on the fashion that I was seeing. And in a way, I was right in a posthumous way. Film set in 2001, but goes over events from like the 50s up to then. Um, but yeah, walked in completely blind, knew that I liked Confessions and was hoping for another good film. And I think, similar to what you're saying there, I think I got a pretty good experience.
I am not afraid to say this. We've covered hundreds of films on this podcast at this point, and they're varied in tones and styles and lengths and time periods and different countries and everything. This has easily entered in the top 5 saddest movies we've watched on this podcast. I found this a very sad film. It really struck a chord with me. It's a recommendation of a high degree, but it's one that I give to people saying like, "Hey, it's gonna be an intense experience," and I don't, I don't shy. I'm pretty tough as nails when it comes to movies. I don't cry or anything that easily at movies. Not saying I did at this one, but I did get a little choked up at this, and I found it overwhelming, but not in a way that's a fault, but in a way that's a feature. It's a part of the deal of this movie. It starts out frantic, breakneck pace. The tone of the movie is very wacky, over the top, comedic. You get these fantastical set pieces, these homages to different eras of filmmaking and storytelling. There's a very much a fantasy angle to this, but an old Hollywood angle as well, or old cinema angle as well, especially those opening credits. I don't know if you had this, Bartek, but we've covered some older films on this podcast, even earlier this year, like Sailor Beware. I don't know if you felt this, but the opening credits were exactly like those opening credits you would see in a movie from the 1950s, where you have like the big title card and then the list of all the actors and the directors and all that at the front of the movie. And often the actors are like in a diagonal from left to right. And they had that at the start, and then at the very end,
The end
the
title,
end in this
yeah.
big Ben-Hur like text. And I was just like, man, they've really captured the look of those older films.
Yeah, I noticed that too. It feels like it's from, those dozens of years ago era where you had things like, Ben-Hur, or even like the Looney Tunes kind of style of music. Felt like something from back then.
But it captures it in a way where it's being specific, but not too specific to give away upfront what this movie is going to be like itself. It doesn't trap it, because how often have we seen, for better or for worse, a movie like, say, Ed Wood, for instance? Ed Wood is a period piece, but it very much is like, hey, look, we've got the old logo for the company, and we've got this, this, this. And it kind of like, okay, it's very pastiche. It's very capturing a feel, but this movie just grabs onto, even in those opening credits, grabs onto the essence of what we understand, and then has enough room to play around and do its own thing. I mean, the cold open of this movie was the most 2000s Japan thing I'd ever seen. I was like, am I watching one of those commercials? Like, it was very aggressive and fisheye lenses and swooping shots and intense close-ups and these whip pans and zooms. It was a lot of, stylistically, the first half of this movie, it's a real roller coaster ride. But then, I know it sounds cliche to say this, but it sets you up at the beginning so that it can knock you down in the second half.
Yeah, well, when you first brought up the whole thing about like, the way the film opens, I had to cast my mind back to it. But yeah, the whole classical style of film opening, it's with films that do something like that, they almost try to sort of emulate being a product from that era, and like, there'll be a whole bunch of callbacks in the film or stylistic elements uh evoking the feels of yesteryear, but really this film doesn't go for that too much, even though the film does go over, many decades of a person's life. It it you said it right there. Yeah, it still feels like a very modern film, especially with all of its like montages, and it was reminding me a lot of Confessions. We had a lot of fast editing in Confessions with a bunch of contemporary music playing over it, and yeah, it was casting me back to that experience.
We
You could
even
tell it's the
get
same director.
sepia tone. When it was the 50s and she's a teacher, we get like scratchy film grain and like a line down it and somewhat like a sepia filter put over it, but not too aggressively. So it's like, oh, it's clearly nudging and winking back to how things used to be in the filmmaking terms as
Hmm.
well as just period piece. But it has such a verve of an auteur, modern director and style. Like even in like the 70s era where it's definitely capturing the 70s color palette and vibe of films. He also includes these, like, I don't know how you felt about this, but these like blown out whites. Like the white balance of this movie is fucking wild. Like you're just like a window will just be like a gateway to heaven in this movie because it's just so washed out with lights. And it does that throughout the whole movie. So even when it's like does the whole like here's a fun Japanese like advert from this time period, it's off a little bit because he's infusing it with his own style that he's like put upon this movie from the beginning.
Yeah, a lot of flashbacks in this feel they feel very theatrical. Like, oh, there's like an artifice to this. Like every time it cut to like the rooftop fair when she was a child, it felt like, oh, this is like a set. But
Oh, it
because
felt like another world.
yeah, it almost felt like, oh, am I seeing CGI here? Or is this just like really good filmmaking?
Yeah, it blends a lot of those things together. So yeah, this is a lot. This movie's a lot, but I think it's all to its goals. I don't think this is excessive for the sake of itself. It's a long movie. It's over 2 hours long, but it earns it. It's the story of this woman's life, and it's a sad one. We know the outcome of it, and we get pieces of her life told to us in non-linear order, but for the most part, it's pretty linear. When we get the
Hmm.
flashbacks, but we get little details before we get to that point, and then we get to revisit scenes as well, which is fun. But so did you like this movie overall? You would say?
Oh yeah, yeah. I think this is two films in a row we've done on the podcast where I was just completely enamored.
I man, when we I don't want to just jump to the end, but the final like 15 minutes of this movie elevated it to a new level for me. I already liked this movie. I was already a fan of this movie. I thought it was doing a spectacular job. But those final like 15, 20 minutes, it entered this. It reminded it reminded me of Twin Peaks: The Return. There's a bit late in Twin Peaks: The Return where they kind of enter Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, and it kind of recontextualizes that whole entire movie and The Return, and it does it in this very scary but sublime way. And that's how I felt about the last 20 minutes of this film. It kind of just it brought that sensation of a viewer out of me that you don't experience much in movies or shows. Only special occasions like this. I don't even know how to properly articulate and define what this feeling is that it drew out of me, but it was absolutely stunning nonetheless. And it really did put this up on a new pedestal. Like, I don't know, like, I'm still reeling from the movie.
Yeah, I mean, if we're jumping right to the ending, I certainly got teary-eyed during the final song of the film, where it was this kind of unexpected payoff where it focused on every character that she encountered. This film also kind of falls into a subcategory that we enjoy on this podcast where it is this sort of epic through a character's life where they just keep encountering like this is the character I encountered at this point in my life, and this is the journey I went on with them, and then that ended, and I moved on to this. Sort of like a more macro scale of, like, your Bubble Boys or your Apocalypse Now kind of thing. And the film clearly has a lot of affection for all of the characters that she encountered, good and bad. And
Most of them are bad people too. Like
oh yeah,
most of
yeah.
them are awful, but the film still at the end of it shows like she impacted them.
She impacted them, they impacted her physically and emotionally, and there is a reverence for them, and they were people who, despite not being her literal family, sort of understood where she was in her life. It was reminding me a lot of. I've played through all of the Yakuza games, the Like a Dragon games, and obviously all of those games focus on the sort of like underbelly of the world, or one of the games calls it the gray zones, where they're not quite the most legal aspects of society and they're not quite the most moral, but there are humans that are working there and they're going through, really real things. And they are people who need to be heard and looked after, especially the Yakuza 7 Like a Dragon. That one goes into that quite a lot. And I was just thinking of that throughout this whole film, where it was bringing up aspects that were brought up in that game, and showing that, yeah, these are people who, wouldn't really be interacting with people from the quote unquote regular world, but they do exist there, and they are just trying to make their way, and reality hits them very hard. Like at one point, she joins they call it a soap land. And you basically only see her time there in this musical montage where they play a really catchy song. And it's just the rise and the very gradual fall of that whole time of her life, where she becomes like the top earning girl in the industry, not the industry, the establishment,
The
and then just
parlor, the massage parlor, yes, yes.
yeah, yeah. And just like one by one, people are quitting or getting fired, and then it's just all over. Um,
Most of them are leaving for better ventures. Like they're building a future for themselves. A lot of the people too, like, hey, I'm leaving, I'm gonna do this. And she's like, why would I leave? Nothing's gonna change. It's all perfect, which is her problem as a person. Matsuko keeps finding herself in these situations that obviously won't last.
hmm, yeah, but she wants some permanence, and the film goes through multiple things. Pardon me, multiple things of that level. And the final song there is kind of bringing back all of these characters together, and they're singing like one little part of the song. And that sequence there got me quite teary eyed.
And it's a song with her throughout the entire movie too, or at least
Yeah.
lyrics of it too. But to give praise even further, the movie has musical sequences throughout it, and they're very pronounced. Like, here's this song. But this one in particular, that's been a recurring thing, wasn't as in your. I mean, it was always there, but I didn't think when watching the film, oh, they're going to bring this song back around in a meaningful way at the end. It was
Yeah, me
just
neither.
woven through in a very unassuming way. And so when they did bring it back, and you're like, oh my God, the whole movie's been about this song in particular, how did I not realize that? It's because it's not the film tricking you, it's the film playing honest with you. And that's what I really loved about this, is it was a very, caring film. I can see some people really rejecting this because it's a series of cruel events. She's going to fail and grow harder and more introverted and get colder and colder. And it's over 2 hours. So, like, what's the point, you could argue? But I thought the kind of repetitiveness in that way just was a more honest portrayal of, like, these cycles that people find themselves in, these cycles of abuse, neglect, addictions, and so on and so on and so on, that at the end of it, we're still sympathetic towards her, even though many times over, you see people in her life disown her because she's getting herself into these problems. And there's numerous reasons in the film for me why I still felt for her at the end. But the most obvious is that performance.
Mm.
Jesus Christ. I had to look her up. I had to look up this actress because I was like, you have to have been in things. And she's in the Ringu movies, the Japanese, the original The Ring. Japanese movie. She's in both of those, so she must be like the leading person of those. I've never seen those myself, but I'm aware of them. And she's moved into more TV work over the years, but she's been around. She's done a lot of stuff. But man, this movie on a technical level works so well, but I don't know if it would work at nearly as well if you didn't have the right actress in the center of it all.
Yeah, there is. The film does a very interesting thing where when the film begins, the first thing you learn about her is like, oh yeah, she's dead, and she was this weird older woman that was living in this apartment, and she smells kind of funny. Um, that's a very, uh, a very. There's a word I'm looking for, but it's failing to come to me. It's a very deconstructive line where, dismissive in a way. The fact that the film at the end of it can give that initial dismissive impression so much depth and so much reverence is a big plus for this film.
You know something's wrong at the beginning when our main guy's dad says she lived a meaningless, worthless existence. And you're like, well, no, that can't be true. There's got to be some baggage here. I mean, look at what we see of her life just in her apartment. Something clearly happened, and we get into it. But, man, that what I like about the central performance is although there's a lot of comedic hijinks to be had here, and we've talked about this many times over, but if there's something about different countries and their acting styles, and Japan can be very heightened in their acting styles, and it depends the material if it lends itself to that. Like we did for Spooky Month this year, a Japanese movie as well that you recommended, Gozu, which also had very heightened performances. But I think hers in this, I never felt it actually was cartoonish or silly. Even when she does the silly faces, you understood pretty quickly, even before we get the backstory, that it's some kind of weird psychological coping mechanism thing that this character does, like a nervous tick she does.
Yeah, you get
You
an
know that
explanation for it pretty
kind of,
quickly.
and then you get an explanation on it later. What did you feel about the modern stuff? Like, we're talking about, obviously, this film is about her life, but we also get good chunks of it where we are spending it with her nephew and the neighbor and this mysterious man and her brother, of course. How did you feel about the modern, more modern day stuff, or it was 2001 stuff?
Yeah, 2001. I still enjoyed the modern stuff, but there comes a point where it feels like you're going to cut to it more often, but you spend such a long time in the past that you almost forget about the modern stuff at times. I think maybe there might have been just a little bit of an imbalance between the focus given there versus given then. But yeah, I did enjoy it. I did like that the situation that our main character finds himself in is ultimately kind of an unnecessary thing for him. Like, oh, I just have to clean up this apartment, and that's literally all I have to do. But he feels himself, gravitating towards this person that, by all accounts, should have been dismissed from his interest. Like his father's like, oh, yeah, just my sister never told you about her meaningless existence. Just clean her apartment. But he does feel some sort of connection. Like you can see that the room that she has at the end of her life kind of resembles like his messy room. He left home to do something else despite his family's wishes. So it is interesting that this character who is related to her and does seem quite different, you know, can empathize with her in a way that his family, the family that actually grew up with her, couldn't.
He resembles her, as they say,
Hmm.
and not necessarily looks. It in all the things that you just described and more. I also felt that when he actually got to chat with people who knew her, not just his father, it gave a greater pull for him to learn more because these were people that cared about her. While the dad, he's putting up this wall there, which he already feels from his dad. Like, oh, his dad is too busy doing this, 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 and this to pay any attention or do this. The reaction about like who killed the sister, and his dad's just like, okay, fine. Like, just doesn't really have much to it. I like the scene. Look, I agree. There's an imbalance, and there's a level of it's there for functionality's sake. You're telling the story the way you're telling it.
It's a
I'm not
framing
as
device.
invested. Yeah, it's there so we can have it be there. It helps push things along. It's thematically resonant, but it's not what I'm invested in. But I did like when he reunited with her prison friend, the one who's a porn star producer.
Mm, yeah.
And there was some hilarity to be had for sure, but I found it very striking emotionally when they're at the restaurant and she's trying to talk to this man who's basically like a little child. Like, he's such a dipshit in that restaurant, and he kind of in that moment emulates like a bunch of the loser men in Matsuko's stories. There's like, we get a cacophony of these men who flicker in and out of Matsuko's life, and all of them are like abusive losers with no real aims in life, or like very ill-defined aims in life. And how much of our main character is able to be those men as well as able to be Matsuko herself, I thought that was played really well, actually, because he isn't really doing anything, our main man. And so the modern stuff, I just want to bring it up because, there is some intrigue. Like, they tease out like the mystery man who could be the killer all along.
Yeah, that's true.
I guessed who he was. I was like, I have a suspicion of who you are. And then the film was like, you're correct. I was like, huzzah.
I was
But,
slightly off.
oh, interesting. Who did you think?
So I did have the impression, like, okay, it's going to be someone from very early in the story. But I was guessing that it was the teacher with the teeth.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah.
Your favorite character, right?
He was a fun. Look, this film is so long and has so many characters that it's hard to pin one down. But he was definitely one that I enjoyed 100% of his presence. Yeah.
The modern stuff answers the murder mystery side of things, and just to touch upon that, I don't know what it is with our writer director, but he has a disdain for children. He thinks of them as amoral, uncaring murderers and monsters in his movies. The two we've seen, we've had small children murder people and not feel anything about it.
Were they both
Uh,
junior high?
yeah, I couldn't tell because these ones were really like they were pretty far away, like physically in the distance of the
Yeah,
shot. So
they were veiled, but she said junior high, so I'm guessing they were like year 7 to 9.
sure, but it's still this case of these children in his movies are not looked upon favorably, including when she was a teacher. Again, we come back to the classroom as well, because Confessions is, all school based. This, goes much more expansive with it, but we do start in a school environment, and boy, do you fucking hate that kid. And then he grows up and he becomes a much more complicated character who you do hate for a period of time and kind of feel sorry for. I don't feel too sorry for him, but he is a fascinating, interesting, and bizarre character. How about we talk about, unless you want to say more about her actual murder and death?
I think, I mean, with her death, the way that the film has the main guy, tell his father, like, oh, they found out who murdered her, and the father has that very offhanded reaction of like, oh, okay. But even the way he was talking about it, it made it feel to me that, it would be an underwhelming answer. Like maybe it is going to be like an anticlimactic payoff. It's like not anyone she knew. And when it ended up being, yeah, just some random kids, I was like, oh, okay, yeah. So I was kind of right.
The tragedy comes in is that she died in the moment where she was most likely going to reach for hope again and turn
Mm,
her life around. And then children who you could argue were the reasons her life became the way it did when she was a teacher to now end it, ruin it yet again. It's like this, again, going into the repetition, the cycle of things and how they go. There's a brief moment in the movie too where she wants to have a kid, and it's like a dream of hers to have a child. And then she laughs it off and says, "No, that's silly." And then we never talk about that again. It's just one of those things, and it's not like a failing of the movie. It's actually kind of sad. It's just like, oh, that's just a funny thing. And then she throws like that's a dream, another dream that just gets lost in the shuffle of things.
maybe I'm a bad person, but that's actually my one laugh of the film. Because she imagined
Really?
yeah, because of the visual aspect of it, because she was imagining her happy life with, that was Ryu at that point, right? Her ex-student?
Mm-hmm.
She was imagining happy life with him based on what she was seeing on TV, which was some astronauts. And so they're happy in space, just like looking at the camera. And then when she decided she wanted to have a child, they just added a child lying on a little,
Mm-hmm.
bed, also just facing the camera. And it's like the exact same shot with the child added in. And then it cut to her laughing, going, "That's silly." And I thought that was like a comment on like the visual of it.
Yeah, I
Obviously,
could see that.
it had more meaning, obviously, looking into it more, but like just in the moment, it gave me a good laugh.
Yeah. Okay, so can we talk about this? Is this a comedy for you? What do you define as a comedy? And does this line up?
No, I'd say it's a comedy. Like I said before, tragic comedy. The film has a lot of, and this kind of goes back into something we were talking about before. The film builds up a lot of characters in a sort of caricature way, and does some silly things with them, but it also plays them straight and for drama in a way that you can empathize with them.
I agree. I always have a difficult time with something like this. Now, I'm not going to deny that this film doesn't have any humor and comedy. It does. It clearly does, and everything you said is spot on. I just don't, even with tragedy comedy or black comedy, I just, it was a case in which it very much is that thing that we see with other filmmakers like your Paul Thomas Andersons, your David Lynch's, or, so on and so on, where they use these over the top things, these caricature things, to bring you to a sense of tranquility with it, like security, like, oh, you're having fun. Look, it's fun. Like, hey, that's the silly teacher whose teeth sparkles when he smiles, huzzah! And the sister who's so sick that she's basically like a little baby, and they have the things dangling over her head, and that's kind of like silly and fun. But it twists those things and turns them into something far more dramatic and far more harrowing and sad. Like even when you were talking about like that moment where it's like, oh, that's silly, and the laugh thing, and your description of like how we got to that point, it made me think of her life at the end, where all she had was the TV. And all she had to reality was connection to these teen idols through the TV, and she became Perfect Blue, the movie. But she, she then became this crazy person who wrote like a manifesto to one of them, and all she had to live for was hoping that she would get a reply. And it's like this movie does have these comedy things in there, but a lot, like not all of them, but a good amount of them get turned into something very upsetting or dramatic. So I have a harder time to be like, yeah, like it's that thing of like, how much do you define a thing as a comedy? Like, yeah, Casablanca and Citizen Kane have very funny things in them, No one lists them as comedy films, though, but
No,
they have them.
I wouldn't market this as a comedy film, but the it is a film that has comedy in it and it has a big purpose.
Yeah, yeah, it definitely
It's
has
a
a
very
purpose.
clinical description of it being a comedy.
Yeah, I just would never say to someone, "Oh, Memories of Matsuko is a funny movie or a comedy." And you know me, I'm not afraid to say
Interesting.
some fucked up movies are like Confessions is funnier to me. I think
That's literally why I'm kind of surprised about this. Like, oh yeah, Ryan's the kind of person who would make a concession for the fact that, oh yeah, this film's very funny, even though, it's not outright fully comedy. So it's
I
interesting that
think
this one is a bit of
yeah.
a gray area for you.
Yeah, again, comes back to what one defines as a comedy, what lands. Now, I must admit, tragedy comedies are not ones I consume enough to go like, oh yeah, this is. I think of dark comedies, black comedies more. So perhaps I'm out of my wheelhouse here with the
I
tragedy
kind of
element
conflate the two, to be honest.
because the tragic element is just overshadows so much more of it. And not to play compare and contrast, but with Confessions, it starts out dramatic. The first 20 minutes of that movie
It's a
is
very long
very
scene.
upsetting. And then it becomes funnier. It uses that to springboard into dark comedy, where, again, not going to give away stuff, but like one of the final lines of that movie is like a fuck yeah, hilarious middle finger to an antagonistic character. But at the beginning, whoa, you don't think you're going to get to that place, but you get there. Well, in this, it's kind of like the inverse. We start out with death. Not to say that's not serious, but we get a lot of like hijinks, but then you get those last 20 minutes or so, and it's like, oh man. And again, like bring it up too, like Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me does the same thing where like the first half hour is a comedy. But I would never say to anyone Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me is a comedy movie. You know?
No, yeah, you'd say season 1 and 2 is a bit of a comedy, but the movie gets serious.
Yeah, but at the same time, well, it has that 35-minute chunk at the start that's a comedy. It's like,
Mm.
yeah, it does. But
It's
yeah,
only
it's weird.
35
I
minutes?
just wanted to
Wow.
get it off my chest because I was watching this. I knew after 15, like 10, 15 minutes, oh, this isn't going to be a comedy film like how I thought it was going to be. Like, I just accepted that very early on. Like, it's going to have stylistically abstract and over the top things. And hey, if people find it, like, I'm not saying I didn't find things funny. I did chuckle occasionally, but I was just moved by the movie so much that to me, I just looked at it as like an epic tragedy.
I don't know. I saw it both ways. It was very silly and used a lot of very caricature things, but that didn't detract from any of the really serious, really moving stuff that it was doing.
And that is the high praise because I agree. I 100% agree. I see those things. They did not detract, they added, but to me, it just added to the greater wallop of like, oh, okay, for me, this is like a pretty serious, tragic movie that has these comedic underpinnings to help emphasize those points. But yeah, it's like if I walked up to someone and recommended this, I'm going to say, hey, this is a sad movie. I'm not going to be like, hey, this is a funny movie, actually. But for some reason, Confessions, I'm like, oh, this is a pretty funny movie. um,
Yeah, to the point that,
uh,
what was it, your brother-in-law's kind of thrown off by that?
Well, no, yeah, well, yeah, kind of. He had that thing of like he compared it to Old Boy because it's like a Asian revenge
Oh,
movie, and like
that's
they're
right.
very
That's what it
different
was.
movies. I
Yeah.
thought of The Guest is one where I do that. Where like this movie's quite funny, and then there will be
The
people who are
guest
like, I didn't find that funny. I'm like, I'm sorry, but it's pretty funny.
the guest is the one that I always think of with you when it's like, oh, this can be pretty funny. And even for me, it was like the second time I watched it, I'm like, okay, I can see it a bit more now.
I broke a yardstick across his face. Awesome. So that's the guest quote. But let's get back into this.
Yeah. You
What
were
are some other
saying
things? Oh, go on.
you were saying earlier about how, the director or the film, does not have a high opinion of children. And I think it's more about, and this kind of feels like a cliche thing to say, but more about like society in general. Because we've seen a couple of Japanese films at this point, and there always is some sort of element of like the degenerates in society, and the way that they, see justification in picking on people lower than them. Like the very first one we did, I think it was, when we did Tokyo Godfathers, we had a sequence where there was a bunch of homeless hunter characters, where it's just a bunch of drunk people going out at night looking for homeless people to beat up on because, hey, they're, the outcasts in society. We can get away with it. So I just saw, the children at the end of this, even though they are young and that adds an element of, like awfulness to it, that it was just more of a product of society itself. And, throughout the whole film, society is kind of what she's been battling up against. So maybe kids not so much, but yeah, just there's a lot of commentary about Japan in
Oh,
Japanese works.
yeah, and in this, more so in Confessions, but in this, there's definitely a commentary about how kids evade justice.
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah, and that is on the fringes of this. Just on the fringes. Will come into focus in the next film of his, or the one after his family movie. Oh, you know what? I got to watch the family movie. I got to see him have a love for children. Um, but an aspect of this that I really did love is the music. Not just the musical, but the music, like the licensed music and the just general score that they did for this, because it really does ride the wave of the different time periods of her life whilst also still grounding it at, as you said in the
Mm-hmm.
beginning of this conversation, in the 2000s Japan. And you get like Michael Bublé plays in this movie a few times, and that was crazy. But I thought it just brought a lot of character to the movie, as well as like what we see in the frame.
Yeah, the film has a couple of moments where, it does a musical sequence, and I think I have to watch the film again, but I think it was all tied to the moments where she was like the happiest with whatever situation she was currently in. The one that sticks the most out to me for, that hypothesis is I think it was the Happy Wednesday song. That's the
Yeah.
one where she was in the relationship where it was an affair. The man was married, and she was, super happy and singing, and then, at the end of the song, that's when you get the Memories of Matsuko style tragic twist to it that, ruins that aspect of her life. And I think at the beginning of that one, that was the one where it brought up the whole visual of like the animated birds flying around her, calling back to that
Mm-hmm.
old Disney style of like, oh, this is a big happy moment. And then
Or the
later
face in the
on,
sun as well later when she's like walking up a road near all the
yeah,
flowers. There's
it
that,
was
or the moon or
was the sun or the
sun.
moon? Yeah, the moon, I think. And then later on, it calls back to that during a much darker moment, but she's still very happy there despite what's happening on screen. So she's with Ryu, her old student who's now in the Yakuza. And he's just called her and said, like, hey, you need to pack up and leave right now. And in the moment, she is tense and like packing up, and she looks out the window and they're already there. So she has to jump out the window at the back and then run across the walkway. But then the birds start appearing in this moment, and then you get that whole happy backdrop with the face and the moon, and it's like, oh, she's still happy, and she even has commentary about this of like, yes, this is the life that I want. It's better than loneliness, and
But
yeah,
that's what makes it sadder, right? Because
yeah, it's this
it's a
weird like
it's a misplaced
dissonance.
happiness. Yeah. And it's a coping mechanism because when she has the, was it Love is Life song in prison,
I think so,
uh
yeah.
that's a coping thing to get through prison. Like, she starts to reuse these methods, like when she was a sex worker, her exercise moves that she used to do so she could get through that job and be the best at it. She starts to do those in prison again. And she has this Love is Life song. And then when she comes back to the barber and he has a family and he has the things that she wants, she goes back to that song, man, because it has to mean something. And so a lot of this, like the music comes back, it's like it's still peppy and upbeat, but then when you see the moon face again and the road, it's now recontextualized as like it's actually really sad. Because does she believe this? Probably not. It's just something that she has to tell herself to keep going. And that's kind of what we see at the very end of her life. She has to crawl through the fucking grass and the muck to hopefully have this be the next thing that can keep her going. Because we saw her give up. We see her give up. Or like when she gets attached to the teen idols, like, oh, this is the thing. This is the thing. She's a person that is like, as we see with many people who spiral out or have mental breakdowns or addiction problems, they get hyper focused on these little things, these little gleams of hope, these things like, oh, the scratchy tickets. Oh, I'm gonna do like those type of people. She does that, but with like boyfriends and jobs and hairstyles and love, and it's absolutely manic. But you mentioned something a moment ago about the degenerates, the focus on degenerates and how they are in some of the Japanese movies we've done. But it is interesting that, a good amount of the Japanese movies we've done, I don't have the list of them in front of us, but most of them follow characters who, for most people, would be considered degenerates, organized crime people or the homeless or, in her case, like a disgraced teacher who becomes a sex worker who does this, 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 and this and becomes a crazy shut-in. But they look at them with a very sympathetic light. Like, her character at the beginning, when the nephew is learning about her from a very othered point of view. And then by the end of this, he, along with us, couldn't imagine thinking of someone like her in that way ever. Because
that's exactly what I was getting at. Yeah, that's what a lot of these works kind of do. They do take these characters who, they're not the front and center moral upstanding people, and they give them more depth and, you see a more empathetic side to them. You understand that, Matsuko is not only one of these people who is now thrown to the fringe of society. She used to be happy choir teacher who, was seemed to be model, and now she's fallen into this state. But that means that she herself, can see this show empathy to people that are in a situation that's similar to hers. And that's kind of the interesting thing with our main guy in the present show, where he's not quite at the deep end of these fringes of society. I know degenerate was like a harsh term for it, but that kind of gray area that I mentioned before. And he's starting to see a little bit of empathy for people like that. And, that even shows with the silly side character that he has in his story, the next door neighbor who's like this punk rocker who keeps swearing in English. And you even have a moment where they're sitting, at the river, sitting down having this serious discussion, and it's this very ridiculous looking person in this, kind of tranquil environment.
Just thinking about this movie gets me very emotional. It was a very harrowing film. It played around with the nature of time really well. When you thought you were done, oh no, we're back to some element of her childhood, or this scene, we're revisiting it, but now it's from this character's perspective. But it never felt show-offy in the way of doing that. It just felt like this is the way the story needs to be told. I loved her father. I thought he was a really nuanced character. I love the performance from him as well. He was very good, and the way that they kept bringing out these layers to this very mild-mannered, repressed man. When she went to go visit home again, and after she found out he had died, and the sister confronted her, that was a very tough scene to deal with, but it was a needed scene. And heck, even at the end of this, we get another she's making her dad smile moment, and it just broke my heart. I thought, they set up from her point of view, like how she viewed her dad as like a uncaring, unloving dad who only gives his love for one of the daughters. But as we see, it's just the way people are. There's a long running dialogue in this film about how people do not express themselves to one another, we get all of these boyfriends who think they are, but all they know is to fuck and fight, and that's it. The sensitive artist, not really. And it all comes back to even our female characters. There's like this wall in which we can't be vulnerable. We can't reach out to one another. And the only person who kind of does that is her sister, who she promptly disowns because she has all of this baggage towards her own sister, who's done nothing wrong herself, but she exists. And all of this has been attached to the sister now. And yeah, it was a lot. I really like the journal that the father had, and just like still nothing from Matsuko. Just every journal entry, he would put that at the end, like still nothing from her. And I thought, yeah, just really, really well done stuff.
I really liked with the father character himself. Watching the film, getting the exposition that we were getting from Matsuko about her father, because I've seen movies before, I was expecting, like, okay, there's gonna be, like, the incident where, Matsuko does something and that brings out some more depth to the character of the father. I liked that the film didn't really need to do that, and it kind of showed that he had depth from the start, because the way you're introduced to that whole concept of, like, I'm the unfavorite is like, my father only had eyes for my sister, and you even have this, like, very on the nose scene where, like, he comes home carrying a present, Matsuko goes up to him very happily, and then he hands her the briefcase and goes upstairs to the sister because, like, oh, my sister's my father's favorite because she's sick and he's looking after her. And it seems like, oh, okay, so he's going to be in this sort of, one-dimensional state of, like, not paying attention to Matsuko. But then she just simply says, and then one day he took me to, the fair on the rooftop of the mall. And it's like, oh, so, without even prompting from her, like, it shows that he did have, affection for her. And even later on, again, yeah, the journal, she didn't write every single entry. It showed that this character didn't just rely on our main character Matsuko to have depth, that he always had it. And I really liked that kind of it kind of threw me off, and I enjoyed that.
This is a time to bring it up, unless there's other things you want to dive into about the movie itself. But I was going to ask, how does since we've only seen two movies from this director, there's a lot in common though. Like there's a lot of not just film stuff, but just details like the goofy male teacher, or this representation of children, or these tragic women figures.
We had a short conversation on Facebook last night. We were just listing common elements.
There's commonalities, but they are executed in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
But which one do you like? Which one do you like more? Like which out of the two? Like or like what about these films strike you or anything like that?
Which one do I like more between this and Confessions?
Yeah, because I finished this and I'm like, I don't know, because they're very different. Like they're going for very different things, but they have a lot of stuff in common.
I think it has to be this. I think this one was just such an emotional journey that I wasn't expecting, that I just have to give it to this. I like Confessions quite a lot, but yeah, this one, I don't know which one feels more unique, but in a way, I feel like this one, even though Confessions does a lot of things that I
Both
wasn't
are
expecting.
ambitious. You like that's something to praise. Both are ambitious.
Yeah, they
But
both have a sort of documentary style to them too, where it's almost feels like the whole film is a montage in a way.
this one, I think, edges it out just a bit. But Confessions, I think, is a tighter film. Not just because it's shorter, but I think it's just tighter. It's more compact. It's tightly wound. It's like a very interesting Rube Goldberg machine clockwork precision type movie.
It's all about the finer details of this one isolated incident in a way, yeah.
And that's great. But I think this has grander ambitions. I think this is larger in its scope of things, but also really zooms in on a message too. I also, maybe I'm a sucker, but I think this is a hopeful movie as well. I think that without again getting it, Confessions has its positives, like things like about life, but I think pretty much it is very nihilistic in comparison. I think as sad as this film can be, those final 15 or so minutes, I think just hit the nail on the head and shows us that, because I was talking about this with my wife and she wasn't too sure if this movie was hopeful or not at the end. She was just kind of like so swept up in it. But I found it very hopeful. Like, this woman who was disregarded and trodden upon and like had all of these horrible tendencies and died alone, she did through her good, like she did give people things in life that stayed with them and meant something. And there's obviously an artistic representation of that, because some of these characters we see in this montage at the end are dead also, but it's still just it just it left on a hopeful note. Like, you do matter. The relationships you have with people matter, even if they don't end positively, even if they aren't, in big quotations, meaningful or important. They happened. People exist. People are people. It actually made me think a lot of, in my life, I've encountered a lot of people at the end of Matsuko's journey in this movie, where I've met a lot of people who clearly had a life that was something, with more potential, but through whatever means they've reached this kind of mental deterioration. I've talked to you about this on the podcast, Bartek, as well as off pod, but there have been people like this that I find fascinating. Like, there's this one I call Pinky that I used to work with, and it's like, she was like a brilliant person once, but now she's like this absolutely drug-addled, scatterbrained. I don't know her story, but something happened there. And I think this movie, even without all of that baggage that I bring in, but I think that movie wants you to bring your own stuff in. It wants you to bring your own stuff in and say, have empathy, connect with people, and also think about yourself. Like, think about yourself. Think about how things are better, can be better, or things could be better than what we saw Matsuko fall into eventually in these repetitive cycles of self-harm and destruction. So I think this is better, and I would say people should check this out.
No, I agree too, yeah. And yeah, the whole thing is, even if someone does seem, kind of ridiculous and not worth focusing on, they do have depth, and there are people that will understand them. That's the big thing about this film. And that's why I
Yeah.
think that final song really touched me. Just like seeing all of these people, both good and bad, just quietly singing the song as Matsuko is climbing up the stairs to presumably the afterlife.
To her sister, to her youth, yeah. It's very good. I'm looking forward to, but dreading watching other films from this director, because he fucks you up real good. Like, Confessions is a movie that fucks you up, but this one fucked me up real good too. I can't wait to rewatch it. Like, I will rewatch this at some point, but it's not one that I'm eagerly wanting to, like I did with Confessions. But that's
I think
fine.
I think I'm more eager than you are about this whole thing.
Yeah, yeah. It just struck a chord with me that made me more sad and melancholic. But like I said, still hopeful. But yeah, maybe it'll change on a rewatch at some point too. Like, my reactions may be greater or
You are
more in the
going to
humor.
despise the film. Like, what? I liked this? What the hell?
Yeah. But are you ready to hear the recommendation for the next episode, Bartek?
I am. I am ready to hear what the listening people's choice for the next episode of Pictures Powwow is.
It is the listening people's choice, and we only have one movie. that is appropriate for this time of year. Did you know that?
When I was looking, I'm going to feel silly if this isn't what it ends up being, but when I was looking for films to pick for my next pick, which is going to fall on Christmas, I was looking at, non-Hollywood, non-American films. And one of the films on our list just kept popping up. I was like, oh, people consider this a great Christmas film. So I'm curious if it's that one.
Oh, maybe I didn't. If it's a foreign one, maybe not. But there is, well, maybe you've got me. Maybe there is another one. But I chose a more recent fare. Our friend Stefan recommended Better
Oh, it's
Watch
definitely not
Out,
it.
which is a Christmas horror film.
Oh, okay. Sure.
Home Invasion looks like. But what was the one you were thinking of?
The Czech Cinderella one.
Oh, I didn't even think about a
Apparent,
Cinderella one being the Christmassy.
yeah, me neither. And from what I can tell, it's just mostly set in the snow. But apparently, a lot of people in Europe just consider it like, oh yeah, that's a Christmas time film. So
I mean, I get
who
it. There
knows?
are some movies like when we did Spooky Month, like there are some Octobery movies that aren't spooky or horror but they just have that vibe to them, the autumn, fall feel to them. So
Oh, I agree. I
I
agree. I
get
just think
it.
that Christmas should be a bit more strict. I reckon
You do. Wow.
for our picks. I mean,
Oh, for the picks. I thought you just meant in general. Well, I did pick a more strict option for our pick. It's Better Watch Out
that's true. You
from
did.
2016, I do believe. But it's a more recent-ish horror comedy Christmas. I'm assuming comedy, but I don't actually know that. All I know is a horror Christmas. So, Stefan, thank you for that recommendation. We'll be back next week to talk about it. So, everyone, make sure to give it a watch in the meantime. And you can reach out to us, follow us, and so on and so on and so on through our social medias of Facebook and Twitter, Spit and Polish Presents, and our email address, which is
Our email is spitandpolished@gmail.com.
feel free to contact us. Let us know your thoughts, opinions, and feelings on the things we have discussed, the movies, or if you have recommendations to offer up to us, we add them to the list and we eventually get around to them. So that is it. Hopefully, next time, Bartek and I will be here together to talk about Better Watch. Bartek, you better watch out.
Ooh, I'd better watch out. You might catch COVID.
Please don't. Please, I don't want that to be my
Again.
Christmas gift.
What was because I remember last year for our Christmas episode we did do it remotely. What was the reason for that? I can't remember.
I can't remember. I don't think I got
That was also a
COVID
Christmas
then.
horror film. Maybe,
Yeah.
maybe.
I didn't get it last year or Christmas. Maybe we just had a cold or something. Can't remember. Listen to that episode and find out why.